The history of this land began long before any Europeans set foot here. For tens of thousands of years, diverse Native American peoples thrived across the continent. They built cities and farms, created trade networks, and developed rich cultures. Great earthen mounds and cliff dwellings survive today as testaments. In present-day Illinois, the city of Cahokia was once the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. At its peak, circa 1050 to 1150 CE, it covered over 1,600 hectares with some 120 earthen mounds and may have sheltered 10,000 to 20,000 people. Far to the west, the ancestral Puebloans of Mesa Verde carved homes into cliff faces in the late 1100s, creating villages of well over 100 rooms. These societies, along with others like the Hopewell, Mississippian, and Hohokam cultures, sowed seeds, herded animals, and built monuments, shaping the continent long before any contact with Europe. That era came to a dramatic turning point in 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed west from Spain and sighted the Americas. European attention turned to this new world. In North America, Spanish expeditions led by De Soto and Coronado probed the south and west in the 1500s, while the English, French, and Dutch began to establish colonies along the Atlantic coast. In 1607, 104 English settlers landed in Virginia and founded Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in North America. 13 years later, a group of English Puritans known as the Pilgrims crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower and established Plymouth Colony in 1620. Life in these early colonies was a mix of hope and hardship. Colonists often clashed with local tribes and faced disease, starvation, and harsh winters. In the southern colonies, with their long growing seasons, large plantations took root, reliant on slave labor. By the 1760s, all 13 colonies were established along the Atlantic seaboard, each developing its own character. The South with its tobacco and rice plantations, the North with small farms, trade, and shipbuilding. But relations with Britain were growing tense. After Britain won the French and Indian War in 1763, it imposed new taxes and laws on the colonies, the so-called Intolerable Acts, aiming to pay its debts. Colonists bristled at taxation without representation, and protests flared. The stage was set for conflict. In April 1775, the quiet of the countryside shattered. British troops marched to seize weapons at Concord, Massachusetts, and colonial Minutemen fired on them at Lexington and Concord, sparking open war. The Continental Congress quickly formed the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief. A year later, on July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming that all men are created equal under a new nation. The revolution that followed was brutal and uncertain. The young Americans faced the might of the British Empire, yet the colonies held together through bitter winters and costly battles. One turning point came at Gettysburg in 1863. During the Civil War, a later chapter, but during the Revolution, it was Valley Forge in Yorktown where American perseverance paid off. With critical French aid, the Continental Army forced Britain's hand. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris finally recognized American independence, and Britain acknowledged a free United States. A small, frontier nation had wrested freedom from the era's greatest power. Victory brought its own challenges. How should the states govern themselves? Early under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was weak. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to draw up a stronger union. After heated debates over representation, federal power, and the issue of slavery, they drafted the United States Constitution. The document was adopted in 1789, establishing the three branches of government, checks and balances, and a Bill of Rights to guarantee individual liberties. Indeed, the U.S. Constitution is a unique milestone. As Britannica notes, it is the oldest written national constitution in use in the world. In April 1789, George Washington became the nation's first president under the Constitution. The Bill of Rights, 1791, secured freedoms like speech and religion. In 1803, under President Thomas Jefferson, the country doubled its size with the Louisiana Purchase, expanding west of the Mississippi. Americans poured into new territories, motivated by cheap land and the idea of manifest destiny, believing they were fated to spread democracy from sea to shining sea. In doing so, they often displaced native peoples, leading to tragic conflicts across the frontier. As America expanded, it also grew divided. The new lands of the West raised the explosive question: would slavery be allowed in the expanding Union? Northern states gradually abolished slavery by the 1820s, but the Southern economy depended on enslaved labor, especially on cotton plantations. Political compromises, like the Missouri Compromise of 1820, delayed the clash but could not contain it indefinitely. Meanwhile, the industrial North's factories and railroads surged ahead, and cities grew. By the 1850s, passions ran high. Abolitionists denounced slavery as evil, while Southern leaders defended it as essential. The breaking point came in 1860. Abraham Lincoln, a Republican-elected president on an anti-slavery expansion platform, alarmed the South. Starting in late 1860, Southern states seceded and formed the Confederacy. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Civil War was underway. The Civil War was the most devastating conflict in U.S. history. Brother fought brother in pitched battles across the eastern and western fronts. In July 1863, the Union Army won a decisive victory at Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the war, with over 50,000 casualties, marking a turning point. Other battles, like Antietam and Vicksburg, also swung momentum to the north. By April 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. Lincoln's vision of unity was preserved, and soon after he was tragically assassinated. Most importantly, the Union's victory brought the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment, ratified in late 1865, abolished slavery throughout the nation. The post-war years were a time of rebuilding. From 1865 to 1877, the Reconstruction era sought to rebuild the South and secure rights for newly freed African Americans. Constitutional amendments, the 14th and 15th, guaranteed citizenship and voting rights regardless of race. For a time, federal troops occupied the South, and carpetbaggers and African Americans even held office. But resistance was fierce. Southern whites enacted Jim Crow laws and used intimidation to suppress black voting and equality by the late 1870s. Meanwhile, the North and West entered a boom of industry and immigration. From roughly 1877 onward, the era Mark Twain dubbed the Gilded Age, America became a global industrial powerhouse. Railroads and factories spanned the continent. Labor-saving machines and the Bessemer process for steel accelerated growth. Millions of immigrants from Europe arrived, swelling cities and the labor force. The economy grew faster than ever before, with real wages rising significantly. But the era also bred grave inequality. A handful of tycoons amassed great fortunes, while many workers and farmers struggled in poverty. Corruption was widespread in politics, and fierce strikes erupted as labor sought fair conditions. By the early 1900s, Americans demanded change. The Progressive Era brought social and political reforms, antitrust laws, safer working conditions, and a push to end corruption. The suffrage movement culminated in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. The two-party system stabilized, and government took a more active role in addressing problems of modern society. The 20th century brought the United States fully into global affairs. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, America initially remained neutral. In 1917, President Woodrow Wilson led Congress to declare war on Germany. American troops and supplies helped the Allies win in 1918. After the war came the roaring 1920s, a time of jazz, flappers, and apparent prosperity. But that boom ended abruptly with the stock market crash of 1929, plunging the nation and world into the Great Depression. Banks failed, factories closed, and unemployment soared. President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with a New Deal, a series of government programs to create jobs, regulate the economy, and support the poor. New agencies built dams and roads. Banking reforms stabilized the system. Social Security provided an early safety net. By the late 1930s, the economy was recovering. Then, in December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into World War II. The nation mobilized for total war. American factories churn out ships, planes, and tanks. Soldiers fought in Europe and the Pacific. In Europe, the U.S. joined with allies to defeat Nazi Germany in 1945. In the Pacific, intense island battles culminated with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender. The Allies occupied Germany and Japan, reshaping global politics. The war effort ended the Great Depression and showed the world America's military might. For a time, the nation was the undisputed dominant power on the planet. Almost immediately after World War II, a new conflict emerged, the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union became superpower rivals, each leading opposing blocs of nations. They never fought directly, but engaged in an arms race, stockpiling nuclear weapons, and a space race, each trying to prove ideological superiority. The U.S. formed NATO and intervened in Korea, 1950-53, and later Vietnam, 1960s, as part of its strategy of containment. Meanwhile, at home, Americans confronted a different crisis, that of civil equality. In a segregated South, African Americans faced Jim Crow laws denying them basic rights. Inspired by wartime ideals of liberty, the civil rights movement took hold in the 1950s. Through nonviolent protest, the Montgomery bus boycott, sit-ins, freedom rides, activists demanded an end to segregation. Courageous leaders like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. brought national attention to the cause. By the mid-1960s, the movement's efforts succeeded in overturning legal segregation. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws broke the barriers of separate but equal once and for all. The 1960s were a time of both triumph and turmoil. In space, the United States achieved the dream of walking on the moon in 1969. But there were also nationwide protests against racial injustice and the Vietnam War. By the decade's end, many barriers had fallen. African Americans were voting and serving in government for the first time, and society was slowly expanding rights to women and other groups. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, ending the Cold War. With the world stage cleared, the United States emerged as the sole superpower. The 1990s brought a tech boom, cultural shifts, and the end of the Vietnam War shadow. Yet new challenges arose. On September 11, 2001, terrorists struck America's World Trade Center and Pentagon. That day stunned the nation, but also united it in grief and resolve. In response, the U.S. launched the War on Terror, invading Afghanistan to oust al-Qaeda in 2001 and later Iraq in 2003. The early 21st century was turbulent at home as well. In 2008, the country plunged into the Great Recession, the worst economic crisis since the Depression. Millions lost jobs and homes. That same year, however, came a historic high. Barack Obama was elected the 44th President of the United States, becoming the first African American to hold the office. His message of hope and change inspired many, echoing the old national creed that all men are created equal. The 2010s brought further change. Technology and social media transformed communication. America grappled with issues like healthcare reform, immigration, and debates over equality and justice. In 2020, the nation was rocked by the COVID-19 pandemic, a crisis that tested the country's resilience. Yet through vaccination drives and community action, the nation fought back. Alongside these trials, younger generations have pushed for social progress. For example, growing movements for racial justice and climate action. By 2025, the United States, though ever imperfect, remains a land defined by its ideals. It's from the first Native Americans hunting and farming here, through the founders' bold experiment in democracy, through civil war and 2 world wars, through the struggles of civil rights and the tests of the Cold War. America's story is one of perseverance and change. It is the story of ordinary people in extraordinary times. Americans have endured hardships and celebrated triumphs. They have torn down barriers and built new ones. But always there has been a core belief that the dreams of the past can guide the future. As President Obama remarked on a night of great national significance, if there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time, tonight is your answer. Change has come to America, he declared. This enduring optimism, this faith that through challenge and conflict, the country can move closer to its founding ideals, is the common thread through all these chapters of history.